Hi everyone, thank you very much for choosing to be here. I'm Sebastian Lesniewski, I'm a senior lecturer and part of the foundation year team at Bloomsbury Institute, London. I've been working as a language teacher for 20 years, would you believe? And my today's talk will be about written corrective feedback. So I want to begin by defining what this is. So we're talking about the feedback that we give to our students in response to some piece of writing that they gave us, and the purpose of doing it is to help them become better writers. I just want to say that all my references and these slides can be found on my website, which can be accessed through this QR code. Oh yeah, all phones up. Feels so great. I started to explore this topic about 5 years ago, as at that point I was teaching mostly English for academic purposes, and a big part of that is about improving people's writing skills. And what I realized was that language teachers are not really trained on how to give feedback. If it is mentioned in teacher training, it would be somewhere under the umbrella of language assessment. So it's definitely possible to work as a language teacher for decades and never get any training on how to give feedback on people's writing. We do get some guidelines from our managers, directors of studies, but I personally often found these guidelines rather unhelpful. So as we teach, we develop our own ways of giving feedback. The habits we form might be affected by our reflections on the feedback we received when we were students, and perhaps we may adopt the techniques that we found helpful, but often our feedback giving habits are not informed by being aware of what techniques are available and which ones are the most effective according to research. So when I started to read about this topic, I came across this book from 2012, which synthesizes research findings about written corrective feedback. There's been a newer edition of this book since then. One of the first things that caught my attention was the division into the direct and indirect feedback. So direct feedback means that the teacher fixes the error, which could look like this. So we're looking at a piece of writing produced by a student. Here there is an issue with subject-verb agreement, and the teacher has corrected the error. Now, we could compare it to the indirect approach. So indirect feedback means that we do not fix the error, but we call the student's attention to the error and we get them to self-correct. And here, there is a range of techniques at our disposal which will differ in the level of explicitness. So here we're looking at the same piece of writing again, but this time the errors are not fixed, but they are just indicated through underlining. Now if we compare this technique with the direct approach that we saw earlier, we will see one limitation. For example, here the student wrote, "Everyone has been a liar once in their life," and the teacher suggested that adding "at least" would improve this sentence stylistically. But it would be very difficult to draw the student's attention to this problem simply through underlining. It's rather unlikely that the student would know what exactly the teacher had in mind. The indirect approach could be even less explicit. So here we're looking at the same piece of writing again. This time, the number of ticks on the left indicates the number of errors in a given line. So the student would be expected to scan the first line very carefully, knowing that somewhere in this line there is one error. They will need to find that error and correct it. I'm personally very skeptical about this being likely to work. The indirect approach could be also a bit more explicit. So now, the errors are not only indicated through underlining, but there is also a short phrase describing the type of error. So there's an issue with subject-verb agreement, an issue with punctuation, an issue with word choice, an issue with verb form. So using this method increases the student's chance of being able to self-correct. And of the 3 indirect techniques that we've looked at so far, this one I do use from time to time, but I would prefer to use Microsoft Word for that. Scribbling over somebody's handwriting is something that I haven't been doing for a long time, and if a student brings me some writing on a piece of paper, I would ask them to rewrite it in a Word document and email it to me, and as they rewrite it, they might actually already spot some errors and self-correct. So I do use this technique, but it has an obvious limitation. Not all types of errors can be neatly captured in a short phrase like this. And I would actually argue that very few errors can be described, can be indicated using this technique. The next indirect technique that I want to talk about is almost the same, but this time the short phrases are replaced with codes. This technique is very popular. It's one of those techniques that is recommended by directors of studies, course leaders. If you ever used Turnitin, there is quick marks, and you might have been encouraged to use this technique. I have never been a big fan of using codes. I have 3 problems with it. The first problem is the one that I just mentioned. Not all types of errors can be indicated using this method. Secondly, there is no such thing as one agreed list of codes that would be understandable to all teachers and all students. Instead, every institution might have their own set of codes, every course leader might have their own set of codes, and even every teacher might have their own very special list of codes that they are very fond of. So there's lack of consistency. And thirdly, while this technique is presumably intended to simplify our work, I feel it does the opposite, because I need to read the student's writing, find an error, then scan the list of codes very carefully, trying to find a code that would match the error that I'm looking at, and then the student will have to do the same work in reverse. So my impression is that the student will have to be super keen and super motivated to actually want to do that. So I know that a lot of teachers love their codes, but I think that they can only be used with the most repetitive types of errors and in situations where we get to teach the same students for a longer period of time. One more indirect error correction technique that I want to talk about is the meta-linguistic explanation. This one is the most explicit in terms of how much information is given to the student. So here the teacher is asking the students to use the singular form has to agree with the subject everyone. So it is indirect in that it's asking the students to do the correction, but telling them what change to make, exactly what change to make. So it could be argued that effectively this is direct error correction. So we've looked at those direct and indirect feedback giving techniques, but they were all exemplified on suspiciously neat piece of writing, probably made up to smoothly illustrate each technique. So let's take a look at a piece of writing produced by a real student. So we're looking at the first paragraph of an essay. The task was to describe and evaluate how research in your field addresses inequality. So I'm going to briefly move from how to give feedback to what to give feedback on. And I want to make 2 points. Firstly, I said earlier that techniques such as using codes can only be applied to the most repetitive types of errors and to errors that are not really that important. If we look at this sentence here, the student wrote, "This viewpoint indicates that inequality not only a serious issue in the workplace." Well, let's say that I highlight this to the student, that there is a problem with subject-verb agreement, and the student changes the beginning of the sentence to "this viewpoint indicates." Does it actually fix this sentence? Okay, my second point is that it's useful to look at a piece of writing in terms of how successful it is at achieving its goal. If we look at the very first sentence, the student wrote, "In the recent years, inequality in the workplace is increasing." Well, is it? This sentence is more or less grammatically correct, but is it a good opening sentence? Is it actually true? If it was true, it would have to be followed by, this claim would have to be followed by some justification and supported with citations. But I suspect that this is not what the student wanted to say here. Probably they just needed an opening sentence, and this one doesn't quite work. Okay, coming back to the direct versus indirect feedback. So as a teacher, you tend to be told not to correct the student's errors. Instead, you need to call the student's attention to the error and get them to self-correct. So direct feedback seems to have had a bit of bad press. Well, there is a good reason for this, because taking this indirect approach means that you add a problem-solving element, which means that the student will be more likely to remember what they did wrong and what was the solution. Research into how human memory works, which I talked about at last year's IATEFL, by the way, confirms that adding problem solving makes the experience more memorable, which is why the guided discovery approach is generally preferred in education over simply passing information to students. So as a teacher, you're told, don't correct the students' errors, get them to self-correct. However, I have always intuitively disagreed with this. It's simply not true that if you correct a student, they are less likely to remember what they did wrong. One of the things we do as we teach is that we reformulate the student's language. So we're talking about situations where the student is trying to say something, they struggle to express themselves, and we help them say it in better English. For example, we might ask a student, "Are you coming to the event on Thursday?" And the student may reply, "I must to work lately." So then you say, well, what you're probably trying to say is, "I'm working until late." Oh yes, that's what I wanted to say. Okay, I'm gonna ask the question again. "Are you coming to the event on Thursday?" "No, I'm working until late." Right, this is what we do. This is where the students need us. They need us to supply the language to help them express what they are trying to express, because that's something that they won't be able to get from a dictionary or Google Translate. This is where they need us. So we do fix the students' errors, and that doesn't mean that it's not going to be memorable. I personally remember quite a few situations where somebody corrected me in speech and in writing, and I still remember really well those pieces of language that I was given. So, in that book that I mentioned earlier, there is a summary of research comparing the effectiveness of direct and indirect feedback. It turns out that some early studies found that there is actually no difference between direct and indirect feedback in terms of how effective they are at improving people's writing skills. But then some more recent research suggests that the direct approach has a clear advantage. The findings are that both direct and indirect feedback have a positive short-term effect, but the direct error correction has a more significant long-term effect. So when I read that, I thought, yeah, great, I was right all along. I intuitively knew it was nonsense that we should never correct students' errors, and now I found some research that confirms it. However, as critical thinkers, we all know that we should question things. We shouldn't just accept what we hear, and that might be tempting if that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, but we should ask questions. How exactly was this research conducted? So these studies suggest that the teacher's feedback has some effect on the student's writing skills. So it's suggesting a cause and effect relationship. Well, I actually used to teach a module in quantitative and qualitative research methods, and one of the first things that I taught to my students was that proving cause and effect is extremely difficult. And here is a little activity that I used to do with my students. Let's imagine that I have a jar of orange pills, and I theorize that those pills cause weight loss. So we're looking at two variables here, the orange pill and the body's reaction to it. The orange pill will be our independent variable. The independent variable is the one that the researcher can control. As a researcher, I'm in control of the pill. I can give you the pill or I cannot give you the pill. But I'm not in control of how your body will react to this pill, so that's the dependent variable, the one that is being investigated. We want to see if there is a cause and effect relationship between these two variables. So in order to answer this research question, I could do as follows. I could find some participants, I could weigh them, then for 28 days I could give them my orange pill. I could monitor other factors such as how much physical activity they get, their diet, their other health parameters. After 28 days I weigh everyone again, I compare their weight before and after, and I find that each participant in my group has lost at least 3 kilograms. Can I say that they lost weight because of the pill? So some students at this point might want to say yes. We will have a little discussion at this point, which we won't have now. I hope we can all understand that the answer is no. So let's try another approach. I weigh my participants. I randomly divide them into two groups, an experimental group and a control group. I give the orange pills only to the participants in the experimental group. I don't give any pills to the people in the control group. Then I weigh everyone again, 28 days later. I find that each participant in my experimental group lost at least 3 kilograms, people in the control group didn't lose any weight. Can I now say that they lost weight because of the pill? At this point, many students may want to say yes, however the answer is still no. So let's try, bear with me, it's gonna get better. So let's try yet another approach. I weigh my participants, I randomly divide them into an experimental group and a control group. I give my orange pills to the people in the experimental group. Then I get another jar of pills, which look, smell and taste exactly the same as the orange pills that I'm testing, but they are really Tic Tacs. We call that placebo, and I give those to the people in the control group. After 28 days, I weigh everyone again. It turns out that people in the experimental group have lost at least 3 kilograms, people in the control group didn't lose any weight. Can I now say that they lost weight because of the pill? And this time the answer is yes. We have eliminated the psychological effect of the situation where some people receive something while others receive nothing. This procedure is called a designed experiment or randomized controlled trial. This is the gold standard for establishing cause and effect. This is how new medicines are tested. So now let's say that I want to follow the same procedure to see if the feedback we give to the students has any effect on their writing skills. So, the teacher's feedback is the orange pill. That's our independent variable. The improvement in the student's writing skills would be the weight loss, our dependent variable. Well, I would need to have an experimental group and a control group. So the experimental group would be students who come to class, produce some written work, get regular feedback on their work. What about the control group? I would need another group of students that would be completely comparable to the experimental group in terms of their level of English, their age, their motivation, many other variables. They would also need to attend their course. They would also need to produce regular written work, but never receive any feedback. Would that be possible to organize in real life? Would your students want to be in the control group? Maybe if we paid them, but that would affect their motivation. So that's the first issue. And also, if we wanted to propose such a study, would it get an ethical approval? So that's the first problem, to ensure that we have a proper control group. The second problem would be, how do we measure the students' improvement in the students' writing skills? We want to see if our feedback has any effect, but how do we measure that effect? So now, bearing this in mind, let's look at how these studies that I talked about earlier were actually carried out. I'm going to talk you through this one of those. So this study was conducted at an American university with 63 students aged 18 to 20. English was their second language, and they were taking a course in academic writing. Where are you going?
Oh.
Okay. The researchers focused on the students' use of articles the and an. They divided those 63 students into 4 groups. 3 experimental groups who received different types of feedback. So group 1 received direct feedback, group 2 received indirect feedback, group 3 received direct feedback with verbal explanation, and group 4 didn't receive any feedback, they were the control group. The procedure was as follows. So all 63 students were asked to produce a piece of writing. They had 30 minutes to describe what is happening in a picture. So effectively they had 63 pieces of writing from 63 students. 3 days later, all students were called back in. Students in groups 1, 2, and 3 received some feedback on the writing that they produced on day 1. Students in group 4 didn't receive any feedback. And everyone, all 63 students, were asked to produce another piece of writing describing another picture. And then, 10 weeks later, everyone was called in once again, and they were asked to produce yet a third piece of writing. Okay, so it's 3 times 63 pieces of writing. Then, each individual piece of writing was scored on the correct usage of articles. So, if a given student got all the articles right, that particular piece of writing would be 100% correct. Another piece of writing could be 92% correct, and so on. Then the researchers calculated mean values for groups 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the average in group 1, the average score in group 2, and so on. And then they compared those means using the ANOVA test. If we see a difference between means, the ANOVA test can tell us if the difference we're looking at is statistically significant. So here's what they found. All 3 groups who received some feedback outperformed the control group. This was observed in the writings produced on day 4, so immediately after receiving feedback. However, in the writings produced 10 weeks later, only the students who received direct feedback performed better than the control group. This is how they measured the short-term versus long-term effectiveness. Okay, so now that we know how this research was conducted, we can see some limitations. Firstly, well, these researchers defined improvement in the students' writing skills as improvement in the use of articles, which is only one aspect of language. And secondly, these are relatively small samples. So when it comes to using the ANOVA test, the recommendation is that you need at least 10 cases per group. So these researchers had 12 students in groups 1, 3, and 4, so that's just about enough for this statistical test to make sense. So it looks like there is some research confirming that direct feedback is more effective at improving people's writing skills than indirect feedback, but it comes with some caveats. So I think it's safe to conclude that students should receive both direct and indirect feedback. They should receive indirect feedback when there is a good chance that they will be able to self-correct. To ensure that our students understand our feedback, it should be given not only in writing, but through all possible channels. My favorite way of giving feedback is to sit down with the student, point to specific things, explain what the problem is or what is particularly good. I didn't talk about that at all. And then add a comment using Microsoft Word. It can be done very efficiently using a video call, probably more efficiently than face-to-face, because we can share screens, we can point to specific things, and add a comment as we speak. I didn't elaborate on that at all, that's probably for a separate talk, but it's useful to look at the student's writing in terms of how successful it is at achieving its goal, rather than get carried away with some things that are really editing issues. And finally, it's better not to assume that the feedback that we give to our students will have any effect on their writing skills. Bearing in mind how difficult it is to prove cause and effect, we simply can't be sure if what we do as teachers has any effect on the student's performance. It's nice to see that sometimes it does, but I think it's healthy not to overestimate our powers. So I'm afraid this is all I have time for today. If somebody would like to give me some feedback, then please get in touch or come and talk to me. Thank you very much.